Have you ever stopped and wondered how an AI model actually learns? You know, how it goes from basically knowing nothing to spotting cats in videos or translating languages in real time? Well, it's not magic, it's a process. And at the heart of that process is a journey of descent. So yeah, let's dive into the super fascinating world of how AI is trained.
Okay, I want you to imagine something. You're a hiker, but you're blindfolded, and you're standing somewhere in a massive, totally invisible mountain range. Your one and only goal? Find the absolute lowest point, the deepest valley. This mountain range, this is what we call the loss landscape. Every single spot on this landscape is a different version of our AI model, and how high up you are, the altitude, that represents how much error or loss that version has. So training an AI, it's really just the art of walking downhill, one step at a time until you just can't go any lower.
So that's the core challenge of deep learning right there. We have to navigate this loss landscape and minimize that error. We're trying to find that one perfect set of internal settings, we call them parameters or weights, that puts our model at the very bottom of that valley. If we get this right, the model becomes amazingly accurate. But if we get it wrong, well, it's pretty much useless. And the tools we use for this hike, they're called optimizers.
Now, the most fundamental tool in our hiker's backpack is something called gradient descent. And the idea behind it is actually beautiful in its simplicity. At any given point on this landscape, you just check the slope, the gradient, in every direction. The gradient points you uphill. So to get to the valley, you just take one small step in the exact opposite direction. You do this again and again and again, always walking downhill until you hit the bottom. That's really it.
Okay, so how do we actually calculate that slope? Well, we have three main flavors. First, there's batch gradient descent. This one looks at every single piece of data you have to calculate a perfect, super precise slope, and then it takes one step. It's accurate for sure, but unbelievably slow. On the other end of the spectrum is stochastic gradient descent, or SGD. It does the complete opposite. It grabs just one training example, calculates a rough, kind of noisy guess of the slope, and takes a step. It's incredibly fast, but the path it takes can be really erratic. And that's why, most of the time, we use the best of both worlds, mini-batch gradient descent. It looks at a small chunk of data, say 64 examples, to get a pretty good estimate of the slope, and then takes a step. It's this perfect balance of speed and stability, and it's pretty much the standard for training almost any neural network today.
But yeah, as you've probably guessed, this landscape isn't some nice, smooth, simple ball. No, it's filled with all sorts of tricky terrain that can easily trap our simple downhill walker. And this is where the real art and science of optimization really comes into play.
One of the biggest headaches is something called a ravine. These are areas where the landscape is super steep in one direction, but only slopes gently in the other. On the left here, you can see exactly what happens. A basic optimizer just gets bounced back and forth from one steep wall to the other, making painfully slow progress down the actual valley. To fix this, we introduce the idea of momentum. And on the right, you can see the difference. Momentum acts like a heavy ball rolling downhill. It starts to build up speed in that consistent downward direction, which helps to smooth out all that side-to-side bouncing. It just powers through the ravine way, way faster.
And then there's another infamous trap, the saddle point. Just picture a horse's saddle. It slopes down in the front and back, right? But it curves up on the sides. Well, right in the very middle of that saddle, the ground is almost perfectly flat. The gradient is practically zero in every direction. So a basic optimizer gets to this flat plateau, thinks it's hit the bottom of the valley, and just stops. It gets stuck, completely trapped, even though there are much lower points just a little ways off.
So, to deal with these ravines and saddle points and all the other weird challenges this terrain throws at us, researchers have developed a whole suite of much smarter algorithms. Think of them as major upgrades to our hiker's toolkit, designed to make this journey faster and a lot more reliable.
Nesterov accelerated gradient, or NAG, is a really clever twist on that momentum idea. See, a regular momentum ball just barrels ahead blindly following the slope. But NAG is smarter. It kind of looks ahead. It first takes a step based on its old momentum to see where it's about to be. Then it calculates the slope from that future point and uses that to correct its course. This look-ahead ability is amazing because it lets it see an upcoming hill and slow down before it gets there, which keeps it from overshooting the bottom of the valley.
But this next idea, this is where things get really, really powerful. So far, our hiker has been taking steps that are all the same size. But what if they could adapt? What if our hiker could take these huge, confident leaps across flat plateaus,
but then take tiny, careful little steps when navigating a super steep and dangerous slope. This is the whole idea behind adaptive learning rates.
And this one idea kicked off this rapid evolution of algorithms. First up was Adagrad. It gives every single parameter its own personal learning rate. It's awesome for sparse data. But it had this one big flaw. The learning rate only ever got smaller and smaller, until eventually the model would just stop learning entirely. Then came RMSprop. It fixed Adagrad's problem by using a decaying average of past gradients, so it wouldn't shrink forever. And that brings us to Adam, which is kind of the all-star of the group. It takes the best of both worlds, the adaptive learning rates from RMSprop, and combines them with the power of momentum.
This leads to a really fantastic way to think about it. Adam isn't just a heavy ball rolling downhill anymore. It's a heavy ball with friction. And what does that mean? It means it naturally slows down and prefers to settle into these wide, flat valleys, which, it turns out, often correspond to much better, more general solutions for our model. It's this combination of momentum and adaptive friction that makes it so powerful.
All right, so let's see them in action. It's the optimizer race. On the left, you're looking at a pretty complex loss surface. And look at that. The adaptive methods like Adam find the direct path to the bottom almost instantly. Meanwhile, momentum and NAG, they're taking the scenic route. Now on the right, we're at a saddle point, and the difference is even crazier. Basic SGD is totally stuck. Momentum and NAG are struggling, but they eventually break free. But look at Adam and RMSprop. They just zoom right down the correct path with zero hesitation. It's not even close. So, we've got our skilled hiker, our optimizer, that's all kitted out and ready to find the lowest valley. But this entire time, we've been taking one huge thing for granted: the map itself. Where does this landscape actually come from? Right? How does our optimizer even know which way is down? How does it measure its altitude or its error in the first place? Well, that's the job of the other absolutely critical piece of the puzzle, the loss function. A loss function is just a way of scoring how well the model is doing. That's it. It takes the model's prediction, compares it to the actual right answer, the ground truth, and it spits out a single number, the loss, the error. A high number means it was a terrible prediction, a low number means it was a great one. Without the score, our hiker is truly blind. They have no concept of up or down. This number, calculated over and over for every possible version of the model, is what literally creates the shape of the entire loss landscape, the loss function. It's the map maker.
And choosing the right map is just as important as choosing the right hiker. You can't use the same one for every quest. For example, if your model is trying to predict a number, like the price of a house, you'd probably use something like mean squared error. But if your model is trying to predict a category, like telling you if a picture is a cat or a dog, you'd use a totally different map, like cross-entropy loss, which is great at measuring how confident the model is about its guess.
Okay, we've covered the hiker, the optimizer, and we've covered the map, the loss function. So let's bring this all together into something practical. With all these different choices, which optimizer should you actually use for your project? So, here's a little cheat sheet. If you're working with really sparse data, where some of your features almost never show up, something like Adagrad is a fantastic choice. For most really deep and complex neural networks, Adam or RMSprop are going to be your go-to. They converge fast, and they're just fantastic at handling all that tricky terrain we talked about. And look, if you only take one thing away from all of this, let it be this. For fast, reliable training in the vast majority of deep learning applications, Adam is usually the best overall choice. It's robust, it's reliable, it's fast. It's really the default choice for a very good reason.
So, we've seen how these amazing optimizers navigate these incredibly complex landscapes that are defined by loss functions. But this all leaves us with a pretty fascinating final thought. As AI models get exponentially more complex, is our current toolkit going to be enough? Will we need to invent completely new ways to hike these ever more complex terrains? Or maybe, even more profoundly, will we need to invent entirely new landscapes to explore, new kinds of loss functions, to guide them to places we can't even imagine yet?